structured data because I read lots of patents. I try to use those to get some hints, some ideas of how search engines work. I figure it's a sort of approach to see what they're trying to protect when they develop intellectual property. So it's not marketing materials. It's not stuff that they've written to sell people on using Google. I sort of look at myself as a detective a lot of times. I try to find things in places. When I look at a patent, I'll look at the writers, the inventors, look them up in LinkedIn, look them up in Google Scholar, see what they've written, white papers, get some idea of what they're working on. And I figure Google doesn't talk about some of the projects they work on very much. You know, so looking at these sources provides hints. One of the ones I found was a resume from a guy named Andrew Hogue, who worked at Google. He stopped working there about 5 years ago, but he put some resumes online when he was deciding to leave Google. And they described something that he called the Annotation Framework. And he had worked with about 15 search engineers to develop patents and papers about this annotation framework, which sounded a lot like the knowledge graph. There were a bunch of patents about the annotation framework. In some of the patents, it's clearly about the annotation framework. There's one of them called the Annotation Framework. Okay, there's one called Browsable Fact Repository, which isn't the knowledge graph, but it's a lot like it. So these were sort of the roots of Google's knowledge graph. And I thought they were really interesting to look at, to learn about, because Google wasn't talking about them. We had no idea they were happening. One day in 2012, Google came out with a blog post that said, introducing the knowledge graph. And, you know, that's what we got. They came out with that line that says, we're going to talk about things and not strings. And that was a way of telling us entities are important, as Cindy talked about earlier today, when she mentioned an entity first index of the web. If they talk about things instead of strings of words that might appear on pages, we know they're talking about solid material objects, people, places, things that we can find out more about, that they can show knowledge graphs of, that they can answer questions about. They're unique things that have properties and values that we can search on. Now, this annotation framework, the patent behind the process I discovered in that resume, said that they might learn about properties of entities, and they might be able to answer queries about those entities using those properties. So somebody says, what movie is the one where the guy says he loves the smell of napalm in the morning? It's Apocalypse Now. And if you perform that search in Google, they'll show 2 YouTube videos about the movie where Robert Duvall says that. So they're not necessarily matching up keywords. They're looking at things that are related to entities involved. And they're able to search things like structured data or information they find on unstructured data. When Google refers to unstructured data, they're talking about text on pages. When they talk about structured data, they mean things like schema markup or table data. There's a lot of tabular data. They've come up with an experimental search on table data. I'll talk about it a little bit later. So this fact repository, it's an early introduction to the knowledge graph. It was kind of interesting because it mentions that they have object IDs, which are IDs they associate with entities. So each entity that may show up in Google, each particular person, place, or thing as an entity, an object ID. Now, and this sounds, if you've been looking at Google's Freebase and which they acquired from MetaWeb, they have machine IDs in Freebase, which are very similar to his object IDs. Now, Freebase was an acquisition of MetaWeb. It was something that Andrew Hogue was also responsible for. So he worked in the Annotation Framework, and then he was responsible for acquiring MetaWeb. He was in charge of integrating the technology from it into Google, which I believe eventually ended up in the Knowledge Graph, because a lot of that hinged upon using Freebase and the machine IDs about entities in different aspects of Google in things like the Knowledge Graph. If you look carefully, Google refers to machine IDs in Knowledge Graph numbers, and also in reverse image search, they associate entities, pictures of entities, with the machine IDs for those entities. So Google's tracking entities that appear in search results by understanding and referring to them as specific strings of letters and numbers. Once again, as Cindy mentioned, they're sort of language agnostic. So they can just search for those entities and share information about them without worrying too much about making sure what language they're in. So Google's Knowledge Graph was the result of that. And I'm talking about structured data, and Knowledge Graph does use structured data. There are different ways that their use of it is evolving. One of the biggest we've seen is Schema Markup, putting JSON LD on web pages so that Google understands better what your page is about with a lot of more preciseness, because you not only have the unstructured data, the text on pages, but you also have the structured data, the key value pairs that the entities on the pages are about. So one of the things that we see in the Knowledge Graph is Google using information from knowledge bases like Wikipedia, the Internet Movie Database, and they take tables from Wikipedia, colon delimited tables, like the one in this picture here, about a movie. And they emphasize who the actors were, who the producers were, what time, how long the movie runs, and so on. And there are a lot of tables on Wikipedia. So they've taken those and put them into their knowledge graph. And Wikipedia is not the only source of information they use. They use Internet Movie Database for a lot of movie information. They use Yahoo Finance information for businesses. So when they perform a query, someone performs a query like what movie, a movie with Tom Hanks where he played Walt Disney. And the movie is Saving Mr. Banks. And Google doesn't have to search for web pages with those keywords, because it can just search the knowledge graph. It can just find that information looking at the properties and variables in Schema Markup on web pages. So it's sort of like a two-level search now, where Google's looking just at the knowledge information, and they don't have to search the whole web. It speeds up search. I looked for a movie about a quest in Middle-earth, and it gave me Carousel. We don't just get knowledge graphs when we search using variables, using properties. We get, there's separate structure for songs by Bruce Springsteen. You get a big list of songs. Episodes from Game of Thrones, you get a big list of different episodes and their playing times. So they're grabbing metadata from web pages, including in the knowledge graph, and providing search results based upon it. Okay, so I wanted to give a little bit of the history of how Google was using structured data in knowledge graph and how it developed. I want to also talk about some of the different uses and the things that you can possibly use on your site. So one of them is I tend to read a lot of patents about Google, what Google's been doing. It's sort of my business analysis approach, my detective approach. And one of the patents I came across last year was one called Augmentation Queries. And what that is Google will perform searches for keywords on a page, and it'll also look in query sessions about related terms that people may perform with some of the searches that provide information about that particular page. They may be things that people may also be interested in. And in addition to these query log results, they may look at structured data from a page. So, and they perform what they call structured query, synthetic queries, which is Google searching Google for search results to see what shows up. They'll show those results to people and see how often they click on them and compare those numbers, those selections, those numbers of clicks to the original results from a page. And if the structured, the synthetic queries get more clicks, they'll merge together the search results from the original queries and from the synthetic queries, and they'll show them all together. So if you use structured data on your pages, Google may show those synthetic queries from them, and if they perform better than the query that was showing your page, they may show results about your structured data too. So one of the new schema markup, there's new schema markup all the time. There was a new schema last week, version 3.5, and it included a number of things. One of them is a new attribute type, which is called knows about. So it appears on the schema markup for plumbers. So your plumber may know about drain repair. So you may include in your schema knows about drain repair on your page about a plumber. And Google may perform an original query for your page with the name of the plumber and the town they're from. And then they may perform a synthetic query using the structured data and the location. So they may say drain repair, Lubbock, Texas, right? And if that gets more search results, more clicks than the plumber Lubbock, Texas query, they may say, let's show both of these. So your structured data may get search results even though your page doesn't actually contain information about drain repairs. You may want to include the information on the page anyway, but it's a way to use structured data to get search results that you otherwise wouldn't get. So another place where we see structured data sometimes, or we may see structured data more, is in related questions. Another schema markup addition last week was one called FAQ page markup. And FAQ page markup is when you as the author, the site owner, decide a number of questions that people may ask on your site and what the answers to those are. And you can write that out, and that's, like I said, brand new. They just introduced it. It could possibly be a source of related questions. Related questions are most likely taken from query sessions at this point. So if people ask lots of questions about certain topics, they'll try to see how they're connected, how they're related to each other. If they're in same query sessions, that is one way of determining that they are related to each other. If they find a page that has a lot of questions that are on the same topic from the same site owner, they are related questions, and they may show up on pages with links to your page that provide more information about those questions and those answers. So that's another reason to use structured data, use the new fact page markup. So there are a couple experimental searches that you may or may not be familiar with. One of them is Google Table Search. if you own a site like an e-commerce site and you use tables to show off products, your site may be in that. Found that sites that show up in Google table search often show up in structured snippets where they show additional information in addition to answers about questions. So if you try to optimize your site to show up in table search, chances are you'll also show up in a structured snippet, and it's worth pursuing. The other experimental type search is one called a datasets search, which is very new too. I think it came out last week. It's the first time I saw it. Google has a link to the dataset search to a Google support page that tells you how to set up a dataset schema on your website. And a lot of scientific sites and publishers and academic sites include datasets that maybe you search for what is the brightest star in the sky, things like that, and you can find an answer because it's got the data set that has an answer to that. So it's useful for sites that are data heavy. And it's not well known to the public yet, but I think it will be as more people start using the web to find information about things. So that's a direct type of schema markup, data set schema. I'm talking about semantics of tables. So one that I like to use as an example is what is the longest wooden pier in California, which is near where I live. It's in the next town over. And it's a good place to take a walk along the beach and watch surfers come out. It's in a website that looks like Warren Buffett's. It's very primitive. They didn't spend a lot of money on a designer. It's a table that somebody cobbled together, and it's got information about the longest piers in California, what they're made out of. And it shows up in this table search. Like I said, if you show up in a table search, there's a chance that you'll show up in a structured snippet. So when I search for what is the longest wooden pier in California, they show a featured snippet answer naming the nearby pier and how long it is. It's optimizing for the table helps you with featured snippet search results that are, or structured snippet search results that provide smart answers. So the dataset search, I've included a number of links on this presentation. I'll put it up on SlideShare so that if you want, you can follow these links to the different types of search, the different patents I've included in here. So another patent I came across was one where they talked about answer passages. So a featured snippet usually has a string of text, unstructured data, that reads easily as an answer. It doesn't include all the facts that you might get from a table or so. This patent was updated 3 times. The very last time they said, we might start using structured data in our answers. So structured data in that case could be either schema or table markup. So using either of those could potentially get you a featured snippet again. It's another way of saying that Google will use that type of information in featured snippets they show off. So I mentioned schema is updating to version 3.5, and there are a number of things in there that they're not just about particular industries like plumbers or carpenters or so on. They're about things like fact page markup, or Google released Speakable Markup early. It's how to mark up what an answer is to a question in a way that says this answer should be read. So if you have a smart speaker and Google answers questions that you have, you as a site owner, you could tell it this is the answer. Google started out showing that for just news sites, but it doesn't have to be a news site. And it could be any website. You could say this is the answer to a question that people often ask. And your smart speaker may answer using what you marked up as the answer to that question. So it's worth looking at, worth potentially using. Okay, so I put this slide sort of at the end because Google just came out with a patent where they said, we're going to do this all ourselves. We're not going to rely upon you all to mark up things with schema. We're going to read pages. We're going to read pages, news sites. Somebody writes an article about Bryce Harper, and it says he was born on a certain date. He's hit so many home runs. They're going to extract information about entities like Bryce Harper, the Washington Nationals. They're going to identify all the relationships between those entities and their properties, their classes, their characteristics. They're going to create confidence scores by looking at all the websites they can find that mention Bryce Harper. And if they all say that he's hit 60 home runs, they're going to mark that up with a certain confidence level that says that's most likely correct. So you don't need fact checkers anymore. You won't if Google's plan to develop this goes through. If all the news sites in the world who write about Bryce Harper have information that's incorrect about him, you do need fact checkers. But if most news sites get the information right and maybe one or two get it wrong, they're going to say the ones that got it right have a higher percentage of being correct. And so schema markup, maybe it provides additional things like the ability to tell search engine this is the part that should be spoken aloud. So it's not going to go away forever. But some of it, where it talks about individual entities and facts and properties related to them that we can search on, Google's working on trying to do that themselves.
Thanks a lot, Bill. That was really, really great. Thank you for your questions.